When I made the sculpture, and I cut these parts out here, they looked all right, so I made another sculpture with them. I didn't change them a bit. That is the work of 1 year, 61 or 62. Some of them weren't so successful, but I make a lot of sculptures, so it doesn't matter. I have 4 in this group. I don't know whether they'll ever be exhibited or not. That is the last painted sculpture I made. That's close to 10 feet high and around 8 feet long. This is a painted sculpture in a group that I call Zig. It's just an affectionate term for ziggurat. In these stainless steel pieces, the only time I've ever been able to utilize light, I think I am about number 28 now in this group I call Cubite. Every time I do 4 or 5, I think I've exhausted my thinking in that way. But then I buy more stainless steel and make more sculptures. But I hope it finishes off pretty soon.
David Smith didn't finish his Cubite series. He died a few days after giving this slide lecture. But he left a legacy of sculpture unmatched in American art in terms of its strength, diversity, and achievement. To measure that achievement, the National Gallery of Art in 1982 and 83 brought together a selection of Smith's most important works made between 1951 and his death in 1965.
Smith didn't move his baby by himself.
During those 14 years, Smith completed more than 400 works, averaging nearly 32 a year. As if to organize this rich stream of sculptural ideas, Smith gathered his work into various series, giving them names which reflect some aspect of the sculpture's identity. These range from the Agricolas, an early series using farm implements, to his monumental stainless steel cubis. From the Zigs, perhaps his most diverse series, to the encoring polychrome circles. From the sentinels, aloof, observing figures, to the huge and unexpected wagons, and the Voltri Boltons, made of Italian factory implements. Much of what we take for granted in 20th century sculpture has grown out of Smith's work and Smith's work alone. To understand that work, one has to understand various aspects of his life.
I don't think I had seen a museum out in Indiana other than some very, very dark picture with sheep in it. That was in the public library. But as far as anything I ever knew about art, I didn't know until I came to New York.
David Smith was born in Decatur, Indiana in 1906. His father was a telephone engineer and inventor, his grandfather a blacksmith. Smith's goal of becoming an artist drew him from Middle America to New York City in the fall of 1926. Smith's first works were paintings. He enrolled part-time in the Art Students League and came in contact with other artists as well as with modern European painting. Smith turned to sculpture when he saw works in welded metal by Picasso and Gonzalez, reproduced in the French magazine Cahiers d'Art.
Seeing iron and factory materials used in a way of producing art was quite a revelation. After my first year in college, I had worked on the assembly line in the Studebaker plant in South Bend, Indiana. And since I have known iron and metal working since I've been very young, it came to me that it should be.
Smith's sculpture did not call for a conventional artist studio. He found, instead, a metal working shop on the Brooklyn docks called the Terminal Ironworks. It was there that he took his welding equipment, his supply of materials, and went to work. Like many artists in the 1930s, Smith's art was influenced by the surrealist idea of combining subconscious images with pictorial abstraction. In 1941, Smith moved to an abandoned fox farm at Bolton Landing in upstate New York. He took the name Terminal Ironworks and applied it to a new studio he built there in the mountains above Lake George. In the American wilderness, he established a factory atmosphere where he could concentrate almost entirely on his sculpture. It was a difficult, demanding life for Smith and his wife of 25 years, Dorothy Daner. They divorced in 1952. Despite this solitary life, he maintained close friendships with many artists. Chief among them were Robert Motherwell and Helen Frankenthaler, painters who were then married. What did he want? What was his sculpture about? What kind of sculpture was he making?
Heroic, major, eternal, but nothing minor. I mean, if you think of his whole life, and his physical being, I remember after his death, as one of the executors of the estate, wandering through the house, and in every room, there was some kind of pair of shoes, working boots, snow boots, city shoes, and so on. And it's burned in my mind like a shoe from Philip Guston, how big they were. And in some way it connected in my mind, of course, this man who liked to symbolically pick up a telephone pole, that everything was of that scale. He was very like Clark Gable. He radiated that thing that made Gable a superstar, that sureness, masculinity, a certain reticence. And you really can't grasp David's life as an entity if you don't realize that he had this magnetism with all people.
What one is physically determines in part one's psyche. I mean, he was big-footed, ham-handed. He had a ridiculously high waist, no waistline at all, sort of like a belt around an egg, and a huge laugh, so that it came from down here, and, you know, he'd throw his head back and howl.
And every 6 weeks, he'd make a foray from the mountains, and the front door would open, and this voice would boom, Robert, Helen. The brownstone would almost shake with it, and he'd have a hunk of bear meat or deer meat that he'd shot under his arm, like a real mountain man.
I think a lot of people not used to that style or that Midwestern rough, physical, giant country image, especially in the East, felt not suspicious of it, but could you believe it, sort of, this Bunyan-esque force.
During the 1950s, Smith married Jean Fries and fathered 2 children, Rebecca and Candida, who became the joy of his life. The marriage ended in 1961, but the children would spend parts of the summer with their father at Bolton Landing. Today, Rebecca, her husband Peter Stevens, and Candida still return each summer to Bolton Landing.
When we came up in the summer, the whole town would know that we were coming because he would have told everybody. And he didn't really talk about his art, but in living right inside it, we were involved in his art in a way, and we were making things. We made little sculptures. Sometimes we made paintings. I know it was different than most kid art because when we went back to school and we drew in school, teachers would say, "What is that supposed to be?" And we would be completely perplexed and say, "It's supposed to be a picture," you know?
Both of you were also involved in the sculpture in a different kind of way as children, in that your names appear not only as titles, pieces that are "Hi Rebecca," "Hi Candida," but there are also pieces where it's stenciled. Why?
I think it was just as a greeting, that someday we would see it someplace and as a greeting.
He had told us that since he was an older man when we were born, that he didn't think he'd be around when we were grown, and that he could say hello when we went into some museum. In the famous photograph where he's sitting on the marble bench outside looking down at the fields, and it's full of sculptures, there's an inscription, and it says, "Daddy makes sculptures for 2 girls." And I think it did have a lot of meaning for him as a different kind of fulfillment to his life in addition to making art. have something welded or fixed up. Some people would bring by pieces of metal or something that they had that needed welding for him to fix, because that's part of the economy of the community.
The shop itself is called the Terminal Ironworks, and was really, to some degree, I understand, set up like a factory.
Apparently it became necessary for him to have a name for his studio up here so he could get credit for materials. They weren't going to just send, hundreds of dollars worth of steel to this guy up on the mountain. He had to have a name of a company.
So it became a kind of, I'm a commercial firm.
Right.
And you can sell the material to me.
Although his machinery isn't here anymore, he had a complete metal shop. He had a big machine just for cutting circles out that would automatically cut a circle out of half-inch steel. And obviously he had the different kind of welders that you'd need to weld stainless steel and mild steel. He was a Class A welder. He was very proud of his union membership, and I think he held membership in the union his whole life and was very technically adept at welding.
When Dan Budnick was up here and spent time photographing your father and working, he remarked about how he'd get up at 8 o'clock and literally coming to the Terminal Ironworks like it was an industrial place, so to speak. That whole atmosphere was part of it. You were lucky because you were one of the few people to have watched him at work.
The timing was really perfect. I've looked back on it many times and realized that he was right in the full swing of one of his most productive periods, if not the most productive period. And I think
Dan Budnick's photographs, taken at the Terminal Ironworks beginning in 1962, remain the most personal document of how David Smith worked.
But I had no preconception of what his studio was about. And when I went up there, and 8 o'clock, we'd take that walk down the hill, and Leon would be there, and they'd start working. And it was a no-nonsense kind of workshop. I can't remember conversations in between coffee breaks, except things that were relevant to what they were doing.
It was really like a locomotive works. When there were overhead cranes and huge hunks of steel being cut out and things being welded together. It was David's force. I mean, David was the locomotive behind the locomotives he was making, so that I looked at it with the same fascination and awe that I might have if I'd actually been in a locomotive works. But I do remember, speaking of locomotives, his telling me about the Voltri experience in Italy, where I think the Italian railroad gave him an abandoned shop, and he didn't speak Italian. He was trying to explain to guys who were doing something wrong how to do it by gesture, drawing, and so on. It didn't work. And finally, he went over and did it himself. He said it occurred to him, having worked in a locomotive works, that the best way to deal with workers is to show that you can do anything they can do as well or better. And the instant he physically did it himself, then everything went like clockwork. And then they would have lunches of Chianti and anchovies and cheeses and slap each other on the back and I don't know what.
Smith had been commissioned by the Spoleto Festival of Two Worlds to create a single sculpture. But he was so inspired by the workers, the factory, and the materials he found abandoned there that he created an astonishing 27 works within 30 days. He had remaining materials crated up and sent from Voltri to the Terminal Ironworks in the fall of 1962. There he began a second series, the Voltri-Bolton Landings.
It had to be one of the great moments of his life. And this was the manifestation of his dreams. So the energy was still burning when he came back and these pieces arrived. And then I guess I arrived a week or so later. Just about every day, a piece was germinating to the point where it was complete. Yeah. And he was just burning the lights night and day up there. Yeah. The most amazing thing was the studio floor. That's where he did his sketching. It was nice because he would work with his feet. He had these special welder's shoes with steel toes, and then he would take bits and pieces. The floor was just loaded with possibilities, and he would toe in a piece and then leave it there for a while and work on another piece and then come back to it. And so there was a wonderful evolution that was going on all throughout the studio floor. It was like a mechanical ballet of sorts, particularly when he used his feet.
I try to approach each thing without following the pattern that I made with the other one. They can begin with any idea. They can begin with a found object. They can begin with no object. They can begin sometimes even when I'm sweeping the floor and I stumble and kick a few parts that happen to throw into an alignment that sets me off in thinking and sets off a vision of how it would finish if it all had that kind of accidental beauty to it. I want to be like a poet, in a sense. I don't want to seek the same orders.
The poetic range of Smith's work required an equally broad range of materials, from fabricated stainless steel to simple junk, which he piled with abandon outside his studio door.
There was metal all on this hill, which wasn't here at the time. It was just a pile of metal, and it went all the way down the road, went down to that pond.
The rich panoply of Smith's material has been recorded in rare footage, shot by sculptor Robert Murray shortly after Smith's death.
When we had the pile taken away, local people were here helping, and they were saying, oh, you know what that is? That's something for milling apples. It was a lot of machinery, and not only just steel, but elements that had already been welded together and then thrown back in to be used later.
I know there's certain pieces where you can see it was cut off and thrown in the pile. So later on, it suddenly shows up in the middle of a piece, and almost as if when he came out the door, he would see it there and think, oh, I can use that,
Right.
and just take it right back into the studio.
The subject matter, as in collage, and his sculpture is a form of collage, it also derives from the materials you're using. David wouldn't have certain materials to work with if he hadn't unconsciously, in part, chosen to buy such and such an old tank or whatever it is, thinking someday I'll have some use for this, but it's not at random, really. The inner eye is choosing that piece of steel instead of that one. And then slowly you begin to move them together and try them this way or that way. And at a certain moment, what you're going to do arrives out of the manipulation of the materials.
Smith's response to his materials was direct, and the scale of his work was not always limited by practical considerations.
One wagon, each wheel weighed 275 pounds, and I don't know where it's going. I don't think it'll ever go to New York. It'll never be seen here. But it gives me a certain pleasure to have it out in the field there. Sometimes in the evening I work on smaller pieces, and then I have concepts that demand a unity in about this size, you see. I get tired working on those big ones. Sometimes you get physically tired. I like all relationships of all sizes, actually. I wouldn't want to make monumental sculpture all my life, nor make small ones. It's challenging to make different sizes. My knowledge of art started with Cubism. And in the very great days of Cubism, of early Cubism, there was no difference in the concept between the sculptural form and the painting of it. I think color adds another challenge to me. And if you used a monochrome color, it'd be very easy to just paint it red, yellow, or black and leave it sit there. But surfaces, planes, have their own properties in form as well as in color. And I don't like pretty colors. I like kind of raw colors, gutty and acid.
In other work, Smith used a material which would add nature's color to his sculpture. Stainless steel burnished to reflect the sky and clouds, the trees and the fields of their surroundings. Smith increasingly concentrated upon the stainless steel pieces he chose to call cubi. In this series, more than any other, Smith achieved a sense of monumentality which seemed so akin to the character of the man himself. Yet despite this monumentality, the cubis were as freely invented as Smith's other work.
There was one memorable evening, and take a look at this. This really shows it. I started out by, we opened a bottle of cognac, and I threw the box in the fire, and he came leaping out of the kitchen and snatched it out of the fire, and I said, what's wrong? What, you know? And he sighed, and he said, oh, I'll show you, and he disappeared. He went to the basement, and he came out of the basement with an armload of liquor boxes, and he threw them on the couch here, and you can see there's one still down here, and then he started with Scotch tape, sketching on the window itself, using these boxes. And he said, I'm about to start a whole series of stainless steel pieces. And obviously the liquor boxes were a source of inspiration. And my next visit was about 2 months later. And he asked me if I'd photographed the new cube eyes that he had done. I believe it's 4 and 5. And I said, no, I hadn't, because they were lumped together. And so the next day he went out and separated them. And then I realized that they were the identical pieces, save for this one appendage that he eliminated. So it was quite remarkable, and I think he was so influenced by things around him. He never threw anything away, because I think he liked the sense of a retrieval system. He had them in his memory bank. I was always amazed. He was a fellow that would suddenly say, I'm going to do something, and he'd go out and he'd start digging a hole in the snow like a squirrel. He knew where everything was in that heap, that it was just a junk heap.
There's a marvelous note by him about scrap, in which he said he sometimes just left it around, and eventually it would cure into what it was going to be. Your father made fewer pieces of sculpture in the summer than he did during winter. In the winter, it appears to work very long hours. Still, when you were here as kids, you must have seen him leave to go off to make sculpture, or been around when he'd start working on it.
From the house, we could see the light of the welding down here.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we would be at the pond and fishing, and we'd come over to the studio, and we would have to talk to him with our faces like that, because you can't look at the welding, because it will burn your eyes.
The deck was just loaded with pieces sometimes that stretched all out along the driveway in front of the shop, or parts of sculptures that were piled up here.
I'm certain that also other pieces were brought out here which might have been near being completed. And you'll find magnificent photographs showing pieces lined up in a row, all faced against the mountains.
I think that was the whole process going on of getting things in a vantage point, and it almost looked like one continuous piece, everything everywhere.
Everything got too crowded up here as the great number of pieces were being made, and slowly the fields began to be used, particularly the one over there. But the other field, as early as 1951, had Agricola 1 out in the middle of it. In fact, it's curious because that's the piece that he wrote saying he wanted it planted.
This is Primo Piano 3. They were taking it out into the field because he needed the space in the studio. You can see Leon Pratt, David's helper, and David himself with barely being able to budge this piece.
I love the expression on Leon's face.
Leon's face is just amazing.
That would have been taken March 1963, probably.
Yeah, that's when it went.
And the north field was just then beginning to fill up.
This next one is a full year later, and you can see how the fields... Take a seat and look. There's so many details in this that are just amazing. And it basically really is a great example of this man's productivity in the space of a year. The fields were very important. I mean, my first impression was the studio, the Terminal Ironworks. And then David just steered me out into the fields when he wouldn't be working or something. He said, why don't you go out and walk around the fields? So he actually was educating me to what his vision was, and it was the fields and everything in place. And I think if he had his way, he never would have sold one piece. He would have kept everything intact, and they would have all been out in these fields.
The fields must have changed dramatically over the years as you came to see the fields, etc.
Yeah, I remember seeing circle pieces, and they were white one year, and the next year seeing them painted, and thinking that was a real improvement.
When we'd be driving up from the airport, and when we were getting close to the house coming up the road from Bolton Landing, we would get more and more excited because we'd be getting here. And as you're driving up, all of a sudden the woods end and the fields open up. And you can see everything all at once. There's all these, it's like candles on a cake.
And if there's anything that characterizes David's spirit beyond its sheer vitality, it was the desire to expand and expand and expand. In some ways, he was like Picasso. He would have liked to fill the world with his seed.
The last aspect of it was to put it out in the fields with the other pieces.
Those fields were his album in a way. I mean, it was his record. It's what he was proud of. He knew that it was a stunning sight. If somebody came up for the first time and sat in the sun on that terrace, you were knocked out by this enormous field. And over the years, many were familiar. The agricolas, or the tank totems, or the first stainless cubi. And it was his sculpture garden, yes.
This was his ultimate creation of the fields. Now, of course, it's all gone. I think in the South Field, there's nothing. I haven't been up there in a few years. I don't like to go back because I guess in my own mind, I want to keep it the way it was when David was there.
What Smith planted here has now been harvested and is spread around the world. David Smith's life is reflected in his work which represents one of the greatest odysseys in the history of sculpture.
I mean, at the end of the day, he might just come out to the deck there and just sit and look over the fields, and that would be, in effect, like a whole army of his sculpture, a whole history of his sculpture, literally in front of him, and all of it connected in one way to the other. And I think that's also part of that stream that he wrote about, that all of his work comes out of a stream of identity. And literally, the stream was right here. I mean, it was continually going on.
My sculpture is part of my world. It's part of my everyday living. It reflects my studio, my house, my trees, the nature of the world I live in.